We're going to move on now to our first speaker, and that's Martin Poulsen, who's a senior lecturer in theology at the University of Roehampton and former head of theology at Heathrow College, and he specialises in the theology of creation. He's a member of the Salesians of Don Bosco, a Roman Catholic congregation that specialises in youth work. Martin has been a justice and peace activist since the early 1990s. He's a chair of the Live Simply coordinating group and a trustee of Operation Noah. Martin is currently doing research on hope in the midst of climate change. So, Martin, we're very pleased to have you here today.
Welcome to everyone. It's really great to see you here. Any of you that might have seen one of the versions of my blog, one of which went on to the core website and one of which went on to the Operation Noah website in the run-up to today, may have got a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. I want to talk about prophecy and reading Laudato Si in a prophetic mode and what that does for the issues that we are looking at today. So the first thing I want to do is to have a brief look at how you might read Laudato Si as a prophetic document. So at the end of Laudato Si, Francis notes that his reflection, which he owns himself has been long, has been a reflection which is both joyful and troubling. Both of those aspects are part of what he's doing, and he's doing that deliberately. And in one of the ways of looking at that, which came out soon after Laudato Si, there was an issue of the journal The Way that looked at the spirituality of Laudato Si. And one of the things that I found about that recently, looking at joy, probably, I think it's fair to say, Francis's most typical expression. Everything he talks about has that word in it, and has that very much, he gives a witness to that in his work, was by Pedro Walpole. He wrote an article in that called Do Not Be Afraid, Laudato Si in Integral Ecology, and he says, if you read Laudato Si in that spirit, the spirit of joy, which is very much the spirit of Pope Francis, what you need to do, you need to start reading it from gratitude and with praise towards God, not from a focus on the issues. As Francis says himself, rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. And if that's your starting point, it changes how you approach the issues. It changes how you look at the world. And this is not, thank you James, this is not Francis being a rose-tinted spectacles optimist. He's not saying, I'm not going to look at the problems, I'm only going to look at the good things. No, that's not what he's doing at all. Rather, it is an aspect of a positive approach, which I think is not naive, it has a depth. So I'd like to call it a critically positive approach. Realistic, open to the issues, open to the problems, and at the same time saying, but you have to approach it positively, because otherwise you disable yourself in addressing the issues. So looking at the other half there, turning it around and looking at the troubling section. Thank you, James. So in another article in that same collection in The Way, John Bayer says that the parts that are troubling, he reflects on these imbue the encyclical with a prophetic character, inasmuch as they are styled as a warning, or as an effort to draw our attention down from the clouds of abstract ideas and ideological polemics in order to take an honest look at the concrete state of affairs in which we find ourselves. To that end, they contain some rather provocative expressions, such as the easily and often quoted, the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. That got a great deal of attention immediately after Laudato Si, isn't it? Now, what is this? It's not pessimism. Francis couldn't be accused of being a pessimist in any sense at all. So what is it? What I'd like to suggest is it's the other half of the coin, if you like. If one half of it is an optimistic approach that has a critical depth, a positive approach that has a critical depth, then this side is also a realistic negative approach. There are negative things that we have to look at, we have to contemplate, we have to reflect on, we have to say, what can we do about this? But again, it's not a surface reflection, it's a very deep, critical reflection looking at it. And if you combine these two, then, as Beyer says, you get a prophetic document, because prophecy has both of these elements to it. So this is what John Beyer suggests that Francis is doing. Thank you. So he suggests that Francis wants to be understood as a pastor serving in a prophetic role. That is, in the role of one calling us back to reality and exhorting us to conversion. There's two things there: calling us back to reality and exhorting us to conversion. And this, I think, is the dual role of the prophet. So here's a bit of a prophetic call which shows that dual role, the call of Jeremiah. As a Salesian, I'm very drawn to the call of Jeremiah, partly because it says, don't say I'm too young. And we use it a lot with our young people. Look, today I have set you over the nations and the kingdoms, to uproot and to knock down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build up and to plant. So the prophetic task is a twin task, it's a twofold task. The prophet is called to denounce, to knock down, to say this is not right, this is not the way it should be, or if you carry on this way, we'll be in trouble. And also to announce the possibility of a different kind of future, the promise that God has in store for those who are faithful to the call. And so what this makes us do is it makes us look really hard at the difficulties, that critical depth of looking at the negative, looking at the problems, taking them seriously, and also to seek in this critical positive way to change things for the better. That's what the role of a prophet is, and I'm sure that as religious you are very well familiar with the role of the prophet and the way that this plays out in our lives. So what the prophet is also often called to do in the Hebrew Scriptures is not just to speak, but also to act prophetically, and that their prophetic speech and their prophetic action reinforce one another, because the prophet is able to put into action the thing that they are trying to get across to the people who they are called to. So here's an example from Ezekiel. Ezekiel is given a load of prophetic actions to do by God. This is the one that I remember the most. God says to him, pack your bag like an exile's bundle by daylight while they watch, and leave like an exile in the evening while they watch. While they watch, make a hole in the wall and go out through it. While they watch, shoulder your pack and go out into the dark. Cover your face so that you cannot see the ground, since I have made you an omen for the house of Israel. And when he then comes back into the city in the morning, God says to him, did they not ask you what you were doing? No, says Ezekiel. Well, in that case, go and tell them this, says God. Because he wasn't taken any notice of, despite, while they watch, being in this so many times. And two ways of talking about that are very common in our world today. So one, how does your action go with what you say? Walking the talk is very important. It's very important to people, that people are genuine, that they act in a way which is in accordance with what they say. And another possible way of thinking about it, which might be appropriate for today too, is that people do sometimes speak about putting your money where your mouth is. It's certainly something that a lot of young people say to me. Okay, so what are you doing with your money, Martin? How are you spending it? How are you changing the world as a consumer? Because you can do that. And I'm invited to reflect on that quite often. So what I'd like to lay before you at the beginning of the day are two possible prophetic strategies. And as is often the case when you lay out two possible prophetic strategies, I'm going to lay out a first one, which I think is one which a number of organisations are currently engaging in, but which I think is not as much of a prophetic strategy as the second one that I'll look at. Okay, so that might give you a clue as to where I'm headed. So the first one is based mainly, or the primary element of it in putting your money where your mouth is to engage with fossil fuel companies in shareholder activism. Religious have been doing shareholder activism for decades, and it has been a very successful strategy in some areas because they have bought shares in companies, which has allowed them to go to the shareholders' meetings, and at the shareholders' meetings to form consortia to put things to the shareholder meeting, to try to, let's say it positively, to guide the board of directors in a certain direction, which is in accordance with ethics, in accordance with good practice, which is a response to their prophetic role as religious. And this has been very successful in certain areas. So what happens here, and it is happening right now, is that a number of organisations have invested in fossil fuel companies, and the aim of their investment is to bring motions to annual shareholder meetings to try to influence the direction of the company. So, for example, one of the ways in which that might be voiced is that the company might be encouraged to move towards a net zero carbon future at some point in the future, and to try to align its plans in the meantime with the Paris Agreement of keeping climate change temperature rise to less than 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible. And there are a number of organisations that are doing this. So how does this look as a prophetic strategy? Okay, well, I think it's clear that there is a call to conversion here, to use one of the ways of looking at it that we've just looked at. So what of the call to reality? What of the critically negative aspects? What's going on there? So it seems to me, and it seems to me partly as someone who is a member of the board and a trustee of Operation Noah, that if a group is going to pursue this way of trying to make a better future come, then the engagement can't exist purely on its own. Because there is a risk that continual presence at shareholder meetings, first of all, might not carry the shareholder meeting. Even if it carries the shareholder meeting, the board of directors might be resistant to the change because of the implications for profits. There are various competing interests that are there that a company has to bear in mind. So the recommendation that we have as Operation Noah is that in order to make this more prophetic, the engagement has to be really linked to a threat of divestment at a certain point in the future. We will engage with you for so long. If we get the feeling by this stage that you really don't want to change, that you're not changing fast enough in order for example, the Paris Agreement to be reached and met, then we will divest from you and we'll take our money somewhere else instead. So this is how we put it in the Operation Noah Fossil-Free Churches report. Investors opting to pursue engagement with the fossil fuel companies must adopt strong targets. So what are they trying to get the fossil fuel company to do? And timescales in line with the Paris Agreement goals, with divestment being the certain response if these targets do not dictate a company's investment strategy. So in order for it to have the two elements which are necessary in prophecy, what I would say, what Operation Noah would say, is that if you are pursuing engagement, it has to be for a limited time, and you have to make that clear, because then you've got the critical positive and the critical negative working together. However, I think, Operation Noah thinks, that there is a better strategy still. So that's what I want to just talk about to finish up. So this one is more divestment centred. So the first one has an engagement-centred approach which can be combined with a threat of divestment in the future. This one is more divestment-centred. That's the place it starts. And, for example, this would be one way of responding to a part of Laudato Si, paragraph 165, in which Francis says, "We know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. Politics and business have been slow to react in a way commensurate with the urgency of the challenges facing our world." Now there's both elements there. The change has to happen without delay. That's a positive look into the future. And also a very realistic assessment that, and I think it still is the case, that politics and business are reacting more slowly than we need them to for the change to actually take place quickly. And again, it's a twin strategy. It's not just divestment. You have two elements, this positive approach and this negative approach. So this is how Operation No puts that. It's time for the churches to get out of the problem and into the solution by divesting from fossil fuels and increasing their investment in renewable energy and clean technologies. So what you have here is a process, again, and it is a process, because you can't do this overnight, but it is a process in which, on ethical grounds, on care for our common home grounds, on prophetic grounds, there is the call to reality. Thank you, James. So the call to reality is a recognition that if we are to move into a future that we hope for, in accordance with the Paris Agreement, aiming as close to 1.5 as possible, then fossil fuels are actually not the future of energy generation. They're the past of energy generation. They're what we need to move out of into something different. That's the call to reality. This is not the way that we can continue to generate energy in the main. We have to shift. We have to do it as soon as possible. And the call to conversion then is to say that a shift to a zero carbon energy generation strategy is urgently needed, and that's different. Notice I've said now not net zero, but zero. And that's a difference, there's a big difference. There's a big difference between the two. Because moving towards a zero carbon way of generating as much energy as we can means that you're not offsetting emissions, you're trying as much as possible not to produce emissions in the first place. It's a different strategy, it's a different way of looking at the situation and responding to it. And we're told that aiming for 1.5 is still possible. There have been a couple of scientific studies produced in the last month or so that have said if the energy transition starts rapidly now, we can still meet the 1.5 aim. It is still possible. It won't be still possible for much longer, but it is still possible. And it's a way, I think, of prophetically responding to this bit of Francis's Laudato Si, paragraph 205, where he combines this positive strategy and this negative strategy. This, I think, is a very prophetic statement by Francis. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good, and making a new start, despite their mental and social conditioning. We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths to authentic freedom. No system can completely suppress our openness to what is good, true, and beautiful, or our God-given ability to respond to his grace at work deep in our hearts. I appeal to everyone throughout the world not to forget this dignity which is ours. No one has the right to take it from us. That, I think, is a call to particularly us, the majority of us in the room are religious, to prophetic action in our care for our common home. And I think one of the things that Francis has made very clear to us is that the time is now. It's not in a few years' time. The time is now. There is still time. We need to act quickly in order to produce the kind of effects that we would like to as religious. Thank you very much.